CSID for having me. Let me first start by saying I'm here in my personal capacity. Sadly, I had to leave the Atlantic Council just yesterday as the news came out. So very happy to be here with you ahead of my travels to Damascus.
Congratulations for leaving the Atlantic Council for greener pastures.
I mean, it's it's been great. Like all of this time I've been spending in DC. It's a big move for me actually going back to Damascus, and this is I think part of the transformation that Syria is going through, and we are going through as Syrians as well. And this is actually what I wanted to highlight in my opening remarks, is that all of those different transformations that Syria and Syrians are going through. I think starting with Syria itself, we just left a 62 years old dictatorship from 1963. I grew up in a household where my own father was a scholar of nonviolence in Islam. He was detained 8 times between 1960s and 1980s. And I didn't know any of his history until he died, because he was too afraid for our own sake to tell us who he is, what he was doing in society. And this is the Syria, and I mean, again, like, if you ask people, my dad, they would tell you like he is the most courageous person they knew, but even the most courageous person at the time under Assad was not even able to tell his own kids who he was or what he does. So that is the Syria we grew up in. So it's a moment to really take in, and I think all of us, I'm still taking this in, trying to really understand this transformation that our country has been through on December 8th, but also this transformation that we've been part of as Syrians, at least for the last 14 years or even beyond, as young as I can remember back in the day. We're finally done with this chapter, and we are opening a new chapter. And as Ala and Wa'il mentioned, there are so many challenges ahead of us. The Assads basically left Syria with nothing. Not only in terms of, we always think of money in the central bank, assets here and there, but they actually even left no institutions, because in the last 14 years the Assads did not only fight the Syrian people themselves and killed them with chemical weapons, with barrel bombs, with Scud missiles, but they also destroyed even government institutions, because as they were trying to feed basically their own army, they turned the public sector into a way basically to benefit the families of soldiers, of intelligence officers. So literally by December 8th there was nothing left, and as officers in the army, in the intelligence, and the police were escaping the capital in different places because they knew what they were doing, not because someone was threatening them, but they knew what they were up to in the last 14 years. It's not only them that they left. Their families, who basically were monopolizing the public sector, also left with them, which almost in a sense, basically, that moment on December 8th was a complete state collapse in so many different sectors. So in a sense, also as we realize the transformation, I think as a Syrian, I'm very proud also of how much Syrians were on autopilot to really preserve the country after December 8th. And even until today, I mean, when we talk about security level, yes, security in the country is pretty weak. As I say, the main security force is existence in the capital. The country definitely after 14 years of war is full of weapons, but what is really preventing the country from sliding into a bloody civil war, as we've seen in so many examples as political scientists, what is preserving that from happening is this autopilot that Syrians are on. They feel, and this is every Syrian you would meet today, they would tell you, we finally got our country back. And that, I mean, I'm feeling the goosebumps as I'm telling you that by itself, what a moment is that for, not only for Syria, but for the whole region. So that transformation that Syria, of course, is going through is a moment, I think, is feeding this hype, this positive feelings that all of Syrians are going through that make them, be patient on 4 hours of electricity a day, internet in many places that is still on 2G networks, for those of you who are old enough to actually remember 2G networks. And at the same time, yes, we do realize the challenges that are coming ahead. What I would say is, as we externally monitor what is happening, I think what is very important for Syria is to give Syria a chance. Those 62 years of a lot of people, when the transitional period was announced, everyone was saying, is this too long? Is this too short? This is a full presidential term. Do we need 5 years in Syria? As a political science, I can tell you, on average, with such civil wars, like Syria, in terms of length, in terms of intensity, the average actually transitional period is about 7 years. So we are very optimistic to actually plan for 5 years. But what I would also say, to Syrians, but also to people who are watching outside, and in a sense, I think part of those who are watching outside, some of us, we've seen so many different experiences that have failed. So I think we are very much afraid of, wishing for the best for Syria, and then things would go south and we would be disappointed. And there are many who actually wish for this experience to fail. And my message is always, as Syrians who've been patient for 62 years over this dictatorship of Assad, I'm willing to be patient for at least 5 to 10 years for this transformation to actually be successful. Because for those of us who work in the policy world, we do know that fixing things does not happen overnight. And that this work is really, for the long haul, is not really for a year or two. It's a generational change that requires to happen. But what is very important is that as Syrians, we are all in to make sure that this is successful. This is not only Qutaiba speaking, this is so many Syrians who are willing to do the work, to take the plunge, to come back to a country that is completely destroyed, to continue the mission. And this is a reminder, I think, also to all of us who've been, in a sense, also focused on, or very much working on democracy in the Muslim world. This is the mission here. This is a continuation of the mission. And as I moved to Damascus, this is also the way I see it. I came to Washington in 2013 because I realized that there was more space in Washington for me to work on freedom and democracy in Syria than there was a space within the political elite circles of the opposition across the region. And in a sense, I see my return to Damascus today as a continuation of this mission, because that is where the work that needs to be done. So one very transformative moment for Syria. It will take time. I think what makes me optimistic that no matter how much time it will take, the minimum that is there, which it's part of the prophetic heritage. The Prophet ﷺ, his main message in Mecca for so many years was خَلُّوا بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Let me and the people be. Basically, give me freedom. And in Syria today, we do have that. You have the freedom to speak, you have the freedom to politically organize, you have the freedom to do the work that you need. And that by itself, preserving that is the most important element, because no society, no matter what happens on a higher level, whether there are so many pending questions, I think there will be elections, I think there will be some sort of political transition. There's a question how democratic Syria it would be, how would that fit within the region. Those are all pending questions, but I think preserving that minimum where there is freedom of expression and freedom of political work, the fact that we have that, I think it is on us as Syrians, as individuals, and how active we are to make sure this transforms to something else. So I feel we've won by the fact that we have that, because our fight with Assad was exactly about that. It was about going out and preaching and talking to people about politics, about religion, about the society, about everything else. That was the fight from 2011 until 2024. For me, that was the main fight. Just خلوا بيني وبين الناس, خلوا بيننا وبين الناس. I think the second transformation, which is very important, is a transformation for the region. Let's be very clear. For for so many decades, Iran has been, first the Assad regime has been the bully of the region. They fought, Palestinians and Lebanese in Lebanon, starting 1978, killed both Palestinians and Lebanese there. They were a tool for Iran whenever Iran wanted to actually go over the region, destabilize the region. And I'm talking here about the whole region. I'm talking, even in the last, sometimes we have like narrow focus to really think about only Iranian-Israeli kind of like confrontation or fight over hegemony in the region. But this is not about that. Iran, for example, for starting 2019 until 2024, was utilizing Syria to infiltrate Jordan, to send weapons and drugs there because they wanted to destabilize Jordan. And from there, and that was the main problem with Iran, similar actually to Israel, is that there was no end goal that you can see. So you can never know, like, is there anything after Syria? Is there anything after Jordan? So the fact that now Syria has kind of like cut off that Iranian access from the region, I think is a win for all of us. I don't believe that the Iranian project, in a sense, was about the transformation of the region, was about actually the freedom of the Muslim Ummah. I don't believe that was ever the case. I think it was a very political project that uses religion as a cover to try to infiltrate, different Muslim societies. But that transformation, I think, is very important because it really allows to bring back some balance between political Sunni and political Shia powers in the region. And hopefully it would allow to actually have a serious conversation, constructive conversation, about reducing the polarization between political Sunni and political Shia in the region. Because now there is some military balance, at least in a sense, or geopolitical balance that allows for that conversation to happen. In the last so many decades, the lack of geopolitical balance was really preventing that conversation from going anywhere. And my own father has worked a lot on this in the 1990s and early 2000s with President Khatami and others. And that conversation was not going anywhere because Iran had the access on the ground. They didn't really have to give up anything. So I think looking to see how would that also transform the region is very important. The third and most important one, which is always the elephant in the room, I think not a lot of people are talking about, we are talking about a new experience of conservative Sunni political power that is taking over in Syria. And that is presenting a new view for politics that we're not really used to. And in a sense, it has been really interesting the last 6 months. I think here in Washington, a lot of people are looking at the group, I would call it, because it's HTS++ right now. There is no name. They're looking at it from the lens of, Al-Qaeda in Iraq or, Al-Qaeda in 2011. And they're missing really all of the transformation that happened between 2013 and 2024. Some of us who also have not been following Syria, especially between 2016 and 2024, they're looking at it from the lens of 2016. But there was a lot of actually not only political transformation, there was a lot of ideological transformation that happened actually in Syria. And a revision of a Sunni view to how actually a conservative Sunni power could rule, a view of transnational jihadism, a view of the Salafi jihadism itself. It didn't start in 2016. It actually, interesting enough, it started in prisons that Assad set up for jihadists who fought in Iraq, and then that revision started in those prisons back in 2006 and 2007. But then on the ground, when there was no more practice, there was actually more revision and transformation to really, work practically in fixing those ideas or changing those ideas that were just merely theoretical for so many years. So we have this new model, which I think it has two important things. One, it's very realist and very operational. It doesn't talk about theory. It tries to implement Islamic fiqh in a way that really touches the lives of people. So in a sense, we need need to look at this project and how it is really trying to think immediately, how can we make the lives of people better? And that is very important within Islamic theology of the state.
Can you expand on this point a little bit? Because, part of the challenge, this forum has been going on for 23 years. Conversations about Islamism, Islamic democracy have been happening for decades, even more than that. But this specific question of a new Sunni conservative model that you just brought up, and what it means in Syria, and what it means for transnational jihadism and transnational Islamism. If you could talk a little bit about this, because part of the challenge that you get to when you talk about Syria is people will say, well, President Ahmed Shara, he was in a prison in Iraq. How is he suddenly now meeting with Trump in Riyadh? Like, how did that transformation happen? Is that real? Is this some conspiracy project that the Americans created? And now you're talking about the fact that there was this transformation, and the fact that he really has not talked about fiqh. He has not talked about an Islamic state. He's not talked about implementing Sharia, where you have places like Afghanistan, and you've got places like parts of North Africa, where the first conversation goes to implementation of Sharia and everything else. Talk a little bit about that.
So that is actually the second element that we need to talk about in this experience, which is it has peace with the modern state as a model to govern people, which in previous Islamic models, I feel in a sense, the latest model usually people go back to is Al-Khulafa al-Rashidin. So, I mean, I think, as people try to move forward, probably the latest model people can talk to, Islamic model, is the Ottomans. But there is a big gap that is left there, and that is always, there was always then a problem okay, how do you reconcile that with the modern state itself, and how much power the modern state and control over society? So I think to start with, there is a lot of peace under this project with the modern state. It looks at the state as a tool of a time, not by itself basically like a project of Islam itself. So in a sense, the impact you have, again, on society is the most important element, not the tool that you are using as part of this ruling. So that on one hand, and I think what is really important is that it looks really at a limited role of the state. It looks at the public space, not as a space for the government to control. So it's not really a super invasive modern state. It's actually a more kind of light modern state that sees that the role to control the public space is for the society, not for the state. So that kind of leaves the issue of Sharia and implementing Sharia. It is not really the job of the state. It is the job of the society to decide how it wants to rule itself. And that kind of brings a high level of decentralization, if you want to call it federalism in a sense, because then each society, can decide the parameters. There are general parameters the state sets.
Islamic federalism.
Yes, so yeah.
Islamic civic federalism almost.
Yeah. No, I agree with Qutaiba, but it's not, don't think of it in the geographic way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because federalism and decentralization is usually tied to a piece of land. And this is about distinguishing between the personal societal space and the political government role. And in that sense, it is a unique model that even, in a way, it's a separation of state and church and state. Obviously, it has its own flavor. But on that, in a way, it's also, it's another variation of what the Saudis are doing in Saudi Arabia, to some degree, right? Again, there are major differences here. One is a monarchy, it's been there for hundreds of years, versus a rebel movement that essentially seized power in Damascus, and that is very popular. That's kind of where some of the region is heading, is how do we improve the economic situations? How do we create jobs? How do we end the wars? How do we end the instabilities, at least the political security ones?
Yes.
But we will manage the economy, the politics, and the diplomacy, and make the major macro decisions. And obviously, again, there's differences in all of that. So that's the piece I was alluding to earlier. And so the question is not about the personal freedoms, it is about the political decisions of the country. Yeah. I agree with Qutaiba completely. And I think that's why a lot of the non-Muslim communities in Syria are feeling better, including the Christian community, is that they're coming to terms that our personal religious sectarian needs, we might be able to manage them with even greater freedoms than the previous regime, with lesser interference by the state.
To end there, so that is why I think it's important to keep an eye on that model and how it evolves, because in a sense we might be seeing kind of like the best model that reconciles the situation, the political situation of the region, the cultural and religious background, but also reconciles with previous experiences. And I think if we look at that transformation that happened between, let's say, at least 2011 and 2024, there are so many lessons to learn off, but also it carries a lot of hope, because there is, in a sense, there was no problem of admitting where the project really failed, and there was no problem in a sense of shifting gears and moving to sometimes a completely different way of implementing governance when they figure out that, yes, this does not work. It works with certain society, but as you expand, because the project was expanding also in terms of geography, in terms of the type of societies they were ruling. So I'm also optimistic about this transformation and what it would mean for the whole relationship between Islam and democracy in the region and across the globe.
And that's what, one of the things that kind of excites me about this is we've been dealing, as students in the region, we've been dealing with transnational jihadists and Islamists. There was never a model that actually stuck that could help in that evolution and transformation of thought and practice. And now maybe there is a potential model of success, and that can change the dynamic between the state, democracy, and Islam. And I think there's a lot there. We'll open it up to the audience. I do want to say, 14 years ago, in Washington, D.C., I think when everybody was debating the Syria thing after the revolution started, MPAC, we hosted, I think it was the first conference.
I remember.
Do you remember that? On the revolution.
Yes.
With the New America Foundation.
Yes.
With MPAC and the New America Foundation.
Yes.
So I do want to mention that.
That's why I said we're also grateful we had allies.
But we'll go ahead and open it up. We've got a few minutes. We'll start from there and then head this way. Kareem, please go ahead.
Thank you.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Go for it.
Yeah.
No, but we have 50 people on Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you for the panel. Thank you for hosting this conversation. As a Syrian American, my name is Kareem. I'm a private citizen. Obviously, I was born in Damascus, so I have strong interest in the information you shared. One question I had that I don't think was directly addressed is the continued, at least inside Washington, D.C., the continued securitization of Syria. I understand that the primary focus of the interim government is economic in nature. Fully understood, the message is very clear. But the primary conversation in officialdom in Washington, D.C. is still a securitized Syria, for good reason, perhaps. I think, Ala, you mentioned something about the efforts that are being undertaken to unite the security apparatus and the military apparatus outside of the Assad regime, mukhabarat, that we're all familiar with. What are the solid steps, if you know of those steps, to tackle the securitization of Syria, the continuous securitization of Syria, whether within the U.S. government or more broadly in society here in D.C.? Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be largely the responsibility of the Syrian government is to address that in the sense that if there are legitimate security concerns, that they address them, right? Whether it is regarding, here are the presence of foreign fighters and sensitive posts in the Syrian government. That's one. The disposition of ISIS fighters and their families who are still in Syria by the thousands in a few camps. Al-Hur is one of them. That's going to be transferred to the Syrian government from the SDF. Assurances to regional countries. Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq has concerns. Israel, they all have their unique sensitivities. So addressing that directly with them or through intermediaries that, look, I may not be able to have a full peace treaty with you, but leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. Or in other cases, how do we build bilateral relationships and healthy economic trade and investments and all of that. But also it is their representation here should be pushing on other avenues to reorient the focus as well, to change the conversation, to change the narrative, right? So be on the offensive regarding the investment business opportunities in Syria. Tourism, cultural exchanges. Syria has a rich, very rich and lovely culture. Food, music, right? All art. And so it is addressing the legitimate issues or dispelling any rumors or disinformation or addressing things that are real, but also provide other discussion topics with policymakers here away from only the challenges, but also the opportunities. And for that, I think that's a conversation a lot of people want to have. I mean, I was in the Bay Area talking to some tech executives about what's happening in Syria and the region, and of course, President Trump went out there and went to those countries and took a lot of executives with him. They don't know the region. They don't know what's happening in Syria. They only know as much as the average person. And so, but then once you start talking about the opportunities there that are mutually beneficial for the development of Syria, and yes, a return on investment for the investor. That's what business is. You see a lot of folks interested, and there is actually still despite the 14 years of war, Syria has positive connotation, actually, when you just get beyond the Civil War period in terms of its food, its culture, how lovely its people are, its geographic location. There's nostalgia there. There's maybe a romanticization of it, which could be good if it's leveraged properly for the benefits of the people and for strengthening bilateral relationships, away from just the, quite frankly, generally speaking, the Orientalist view of looking at the region and its people either as victims, poor immigrants who are drowning in the Mediterranean, or as terrorists.
Yeah. And if I also may add to that, so...
Can I ask the panelists to keep the answers short? Because there are a lot of questions.
Sure.
If you could add, since you're not a government official yet, either in Syria or Washington, Damascus or Washington, can you add to the security conversation quickly? Israel is the big elephant in the room. I don't think many people...
So I was going to talk about that, actually. I was going to talk about that, but briefly.
How is Israel going to allow a viable, democratic state that has a military and is capable of defending itself and its borders? How will Israel allow that on its work?
Yeah, so I think that requires a whole panel, but let me do my best. Karim, I couldn't agree more with you, and I think you know best that this issue of looking at the whole region through the lens of CT, or counterterrorism, is not unique to Syria. It is an issue that has bedeviled me personally. I move in policy circles. We have a lot of conversations with lawmakers and government officials, and this has been a constant refrain in every single conversation. Like, you want to address lawmakers and talk to them about, the Syrian as a human being, etc. And the focus is always on CT. But again, that's not unique to Syria. That's sadly, in the past, U.S. policy towards the Middle East was energy and CT, and as thanks to fracking, energy took a backseat, and now it's mostly CT. That's number one. Number two, and that's to your point, Haris, we have a very powerful neighbor to the south, and they have a lot of clout and influence in Washington, D.C. Okay? So that aspect of the conversation, the security aspect, will always be there. Now,